When people think of ancient Egypt, they imagine pyramids, pharaohs, and golden masks, yet few expect that the land of the Nile was once ruled by kings from the south. This story begins with a question that changes everything. What if the greatest revival of Egypt did not come from within Egypt at all, but from Nubia? Imagine a time when temples were crumbling, when foreign threats pressed from every horizon, and when Egypt seemed to be fading into memory. Into this moment walked warrior kings, crowned in gold, carrying the ancient gods with them, not as conquerors who erased the past, but as believers who restored it. These kings ruled not for a season, but for a century. Their names were whispered with fear by enemies and praised by priests in Thebes. Their armies marched north while their prayers traveled to Amun. They rebuilt temples, revived rituals, and ruled as pharaohs in every sense of the word. Yet history often hides them behind silence. Many schoolbooks skip their reign. Many documentaries rush past them. But for 100 years, Nubia ruled Egypt and reshaped its destiny. This is not a footnote story. This is a turning point. This is the age when Africa ruled Africa, when black kings from Kush wore the double crown and claimed the legacy of the pyramids. If you have ever wondered who truly saved ancient Egypt in its darkest hour, then stay with this story. Because once you see how Nubia rose, you will never see Egypt the same way again. The land of Nubia stretched south of Egypt along the Nile through what is today Sudan. Long before Nubian kings ruled Egypt, this region had its own deep civilization. Nubians traded gold, ivory, cattle, and soldiers with Egypt for centuries. At times they were rivals. At times they were allies. Egyptian armies marched south and Nubian archers marched north. Over generations, cultures mixed, faiths blended, and borders shifted. By the time Egypt entered its age of decline, known as the Third Intermediate period, the balance of power was changing. Egypt was divided. Local rulers fought each other. Libyan dynasties held power in the north while priests controlled the south. Unity was broken. Temples lost funding. Old traditions weakened. In Nubia, however, something different was happening. A strong, centralized kingdom was rising. Around the city of Napata, near the holy mountain of Jebel Barkal, Nubian kings embraced Egyptian religion with passion. They worshipped Amun as the supreme god. They studied ancient texts. They modeled their rule on old kingdom ideals. They believed they were chosen to restore Ma'at, the cosmic order. This belief gave them purpose and legitimacy. The Nubian king Kashta was the first to push north peacefully, extending influence into Upper Egypt. His son Piye would go further. Piye believed Egypt was corrupt and that the gods demanded correction. He gathered his army not just for conquest, but for purification. When he marched north, he recorded his campaign on stone not as a boast, but as a moral lesson. He scolded Egyptian rulers for neglecting temples. He demanded ritual submission. When cities surrendered, he spared them if they honored Amun. This was not a foreign invasion in the usual sense. It was a religious crusade to reclaim Egypt for its gods. By the time Piye returned south, he had become pharaoh of a united land. Nubia now ruled Egypt, and the first stone of a 100-year reign had been laid. Piye victory did not end the struggle for Egypt. It marked the beginning of a long effort to hold together a fragile land. When Piye returned to Nubia, he left local rulers in place as long as they swore loyalty to Amun and to him as pharaoh. This decision showed his belief that Egypt could be healed through faith rather than endless war. Yet Egypt was not peaceful. In the north, powerful leaders still dreamed of independence. The Nile Delta was crowded with ambitious chiefs who accepted Nubian rule only because they had no choice. Piye understood this danger, but he trusted that devotion to the gods would bind the land. He ruled more as a sacred king than as a constant warrior. His reign set the tone for Nubian rule. Tradition, ritual, and moral authority mattered as much as armies. After Piye's death, the throne passed to his brother Shabaka. Where Piye was a visionary, Shabaka was an organizer. He moved the royal focus deeper into Egypt and took a more direct role in governing. Shabaka understood that ruling Egypt required more than religious legitimacy. It required control. He removed rival rulers who showed signs of rebellion and replaced them with loyal officials. He also invested heavily in restoring ancient traditions. Shabaka ordered the copying of old religious texts that were in danger of being lost. One famous example is the Memphite theology, which he had carved into stone to preserve it for eternity. This act alone shows how Nubian rulers saw themselves not as destroyers but as guardians of Egyptian civilization. They believed Egypt's greatness lay in its ancient wisdom, and that wisdom needed protection. Shabaka ruled as pharaoh from Memphis and Thebes, presenting himself in full Egyptian style. He wore the double crown, built monuments, and performed rituals, exactly as earlier pharaohs had done. To the priests, he was a gift from the gods. To many common people, he represented stability after decades of chaos. Yet outside Egypt, a new threat was rising. The Assyrian Empire was expanding westward with unmatched military power. Their armies were brutal, disciplined, and relentless. They had already crushed kingdoms in the Near East, and soon their gaze turned toward Egypt. Shabaka prepared as best he could, strengthening defenses and seeking alliances. But the scale of Assyrian power was unlike anything Egypt had faced in centuries. After Shabaka came Shabitku, who continued Nubian policies and maintained control over Egypt. His reign was marked by increasing tension with Assyria. The Assyrians saw Egypt as a prize and as a threat because Egypt supported rebellions against them in the Levant. Nubian pharaohs believed it was their duty to protect fellow states and uphold balance. This belief pulled Egypt into direct conflict with Assyria. Battles were fought far from the Nile in places like Palestine and Phoenicia. Sometimes Egypt and its allies won temporary victories. Often they suffered defeats. These distant wars drained resources and tested Nubian rule. The most famous of the Nubian pharaohs was Taharqa. His name echoes through history because his reign captured both the glory and the struggle of Nubian Egypt. Taharqa came to the throne young, strong, and confident. He embraced the role of divine king fully. Under him, Egypt experienced a cultural revival. Temples were expanded at Karnak, Luxor, and elsewhere. Building projects flourished. Art returned to classical styles inspired by the Old Kingdom. Taharqa even built pyramids in Nubia, continuing a tradition that Egypt itself had abandoned centuries earlier. These pyramids were smaller but numerous, symbolizing a revival of ancient royal customs. Taharqa saw himself as a protector of the Nile world. He supported revolts against Assyria and challenged their influence openly. For a time, he succeeded. Assyrian armies were pushed back, and Egypt enjoyed a brief sense of security. But Assyria was patient and powerful. They returned with greater force. Invasion followed invasion. Cities fell. Memphis was captured. Taharqa fought bravely, but the odds were overwhelming. Eventually, he retreated south, leaving Egypt contested and wounded. His struggle marked a turning point. Nubian rule was no longer unchallenged. Despite these pressures, Nubian kings never abandoned their vision. They continued to rule parts of Egypt and Nubia and maintained religious authority, even when Assyrian-backed rulers took control. In the north, Nubian influence remained strong in the south. Priests still honored Nubian pharaohs. Temples still recorded their names. The idea that Nubian kings were chosen by Amun did not disappear overnight. It lived on in rituals and memories. This period shows that Nubian rule was not a simple conquest followed by decline. It was a complex era of revival, resistance, and belief. Nubian kings faced impossible challenges, yet they left a lasting mark. They preserved texts, rebuilt temples, and reminded Egypt of its ancient soul. Without them, much of what we know as classical Egyptian culture might have vanished forever. The next part of this story reveals how the final years of Nubian rule unfolded and how their legacy survived even after power slipped from their hands. The later years of Nubian rule were shaped by survival rather than expansion. After Taharqa retreat, the political heart of Egypt was fractured again. Assyrian forces installed local rulers who answered to them and claimed the throne in the north. One of these rulers was Psamtik, who would later found a new Egyptian dynasty. Yet Nubian authority did not vanish. In Upper Egypt and Nubia itself, the Kushite kings still ruled with confidence. Taharqa withdrew to Napata, where he continued to reign as pharaoh in spirit and name. He did not see his retreat as defeat, but as a strategic withdrawal to sacred ground. From Napata, he maintained religious leadership and planned resistance. After Taharqa's death, his nephew Tantamani took the throne. Tantamani believed strongly that the gods still favored Nubian rule over Egypt. He experienced a dream in which Amun promised him victory and command over the north. Inspired by this vision, Tantamani gathered his forces and marched north once again. His campaign began with success. Thebes welcomed him as a legitimate pharaoh. Local rulers fell and Memphis was recaptured. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Nubian rule might be restored fully. Temples resumed. Nubian rituals and inscriptions praised the return of the true kings. This hope did not last. Assyria responded with overwhelming force. Their armies returned with speed and fury. They marched deep into Egypt, crushing resistance city by city. Memphis fell again, and this time the Assyrians did not hesitate. They sacked Thebes, the great religious capital of Egypt. Temples were looted, treasures were taken, and the psychological blow was immense. For centuries, Thebes had been considered untouchable. Its fall sent a clear message. Nubian power in Egypt was broken beyond repair. Tantamani retreated south like his predecessor. He continued to rule Nubia, but Egypt was effectively lost. The Assyrians installed Psamtik as their client ruler, and Nubian influence in Egypt was reduced to memory and ritual. Yet even in loss, Nubian kings maintained dignity. They did not abandon Egyptian traditions. They continued to call themselves pharaohs. They continued to build temples and pyramids in Nubia. They preserved the culture they had fought to protect. What followed was not the end of Nubian civilization, but its transformation. The Kingdom of Kush shifted its center further south to Meroe. There it developed a unique identity blending Egyptian traditions with local African culture. Writing systems evolved, art styles changed, and trade networks expanded deep into Africa. The memory of ruling Egypt became a source of pride and legitimacy for later Kushite rulers. They were heirs to both Nubian strength and Egyptian wisdom. In Egypt, the official narrative slowly erased Nubian rule. Later dynasties portrayed themselves as restorers of order after foreign domination. Inscriptions downplayed Kushite achievements or omitted them entirely. Greek historians writing centuries later mentioned the Nubian pharaohs only briefly. Over time, the idea that Nubia had ruled Egypt faded from popular memory. Yet the evidence remained carved in stone, buried in sand, and preserved in temples far from the delta. Modern archaeology has brought this story back into the light. Excavations in Sudan revealed dozens of Nubian pyramids at sites like El Kuru Nuri and Meroe. Inscriptions confirmed the names and titles of Nubian kings as pharaohs of Egypt. Temples showed scenes of Nubian rulers making offerings to Egyptian gods. These discoveries challenged old assumptions about ancient Africa. They proved that power, influence, and culture flowed both north and south along the Nile. The century of Nubian rule over, Egypt stands as a rare moment when Africa unified itself under shared belief rather than conquest alone. Nubian kings did not seek to replace Egyptian identity. They sought to revive it. They saw themselves as protectors chosen by the gods to restore balance. Their failure was not due to weakness or lack of vision, but to the rise of empires beyond. The Nile world, Against Assyria, even Egypt at its strongest would have struggled. Yet the impact of Nubian rule cannot be measured only by political control. It lies in what was preserved. Sacred texts were saved, rituals were restored, and artistic traditions were revived. The Kushite pharaohs reminded Egypt of its past and in doing so shaped its future. Even after their rule ended, the site dynasty that followed adopted many practices, revived by the Nubians. In this way, Nubian influence lived on quietly within Egypt itself. This portion of the story reveals a powerful truth. Nubian rule did not end in simple defeat. It evolved into legacy. Their century on the throne left marks that endured long after armies withdrew. To understand ancient Egypt fully, one must look south and acknowledge the kings of Kush who once wore the double crown and ruled the two lands as one. The final meaning of Nubian rule over Egypt is not found only in battles or lost thrones. It is found in identity, memory, and truth. For 100 years, the Nile was ruled from the south. This fact alone reshapes how ancient history must be understood. Nubia was not a shadow of Egypt. It was a power with its own kings, its own vision, and its own destiny. When Egypt weakened, Nubia did not simply take advantage. Nubia responded with belief, purpose, and responsibility. The Kushite kings believed Egypt was sacred to all Nile peoples. They believed chaos threatened the balance of the world. Their rise was driven by faith as much as force. Even after Egypt was lost, the Kushite kingdom did not collapse. It endured for centuries. While Assyria faded and later empires rose and fell, Kush remained strong in Africa. Meroe became a center of iron production, trade, and learning. Kushite queens known as Kandakes ruled with authority. Armies marched, diplomacy flourished, and African culture evolved independently while still honoring ancient connections. This continuity proves that Nubian greatness did not depend on Egypt. Egypt was a chapter, not the whole story. The erasure of Nubian rule from popular history was not accidental. Later powers shaped narratives to center themselves. Colonial-era scholars often dismissed African achievement or framed it as borrowed. Nubian pharaohs challenged these views. They showed that African states could conquer, preserve, and govern complex civilizations. They ruled Egypt not as outsiders but as heirs. Their statues show proud features, strong posture, and divine confidence. Their inscriptions speak of duty, not plunder. Their buildings reflect reverence, not replacement. Today, this story matters more than ever. It reminds the world that history is larger than a single region or people. It reminds Africa of its deep legacy of leadership, scholarship, and power. It challenges outdated ideas about civilization and influence. Nubian rule over Egypt was not an anomaly. It was the result of centuries of interaction, trade, and shared belief along the Nile. Borders shifted, but culture flowed continuously. When visitors stand before the pyramids of Nubia today, they often feel surprise. These structures are quieter, smaller, and less known than those at Giza, yet they speak just as powerfully. They tell of kings who looked north and south and saw one world. They tell of a time when Africa was united by river, faith, and crown. They stand as witnesses to a forgotten empire that once saved Egypt from itself. The century of Nubian rule was not the end of Egypt. It was a revival. Without the Kushite kings, many traditions might have vanished during the chaos of division. They stabilized worship, restored temples, and protected sacred knowledge. Later, Egyptian dynasties inherited a renewed culture thanks in part to Nubian stewardship. Even in defeat, the Kushites shaped what followed. History is not only written by victors. It is written by those whose stories survive. For too long, the story of Nubia ruling Egypt was buried. Now it is returning to light through archaeology scholarship and voices determined to tell the full truth. This truth is clear. Nubia ruled Egypt for 100 years. They ruled with faith, strength, and vision. They left a legacy carved in stone, written in ritual and flowing forever in the waters of the Nile. When we remember this, we do more than correct a timeline. We restore balance to history itself.